I was really nervous that I would fail, and also that I had to pick one type of law. And if I didn't pick the right one, it would be a disaster. And I originally was very sure that I wanted to do environmental law until I spent a summer associate position, one half summer at a U.S. PERG and doing Clean Water Act review. So boring. And so I realized then and there that I couldn't just do administrative type law and I needed to do something else. But, I've dabbled in a little bit of everything. And I think if I would have known at the beginning, what I tell law students is, you may have an idea about your career that it's going to go in this one direction that some people might know, I want to be a litigator. That's all I want to do. But I tried litigation. I didn't love it. Having the background has been helpful as a GC. I've tried a little bit of everything, and I think that makes you a valuable general counsel, and also it makes you more empathetic for all the people on your team. So I think if there's one thing I would want people to take away is that, just because you're doing something today doesn't mean you have to be doing it tomorrow. You might need to create a path for how do you get to the other thing that you're really looking to do. But and that's through networking, talking to people, educating yourself, getting certifications or what have you. But you can do so much with a legal degree, whether it's in the legal team or outside the legal team.
When you build a legal career across startups, nonprofits, and public companies, you pick up more than just technical skills. You learn adaptability, leadership under pressure, and how to carve your own lane in spaces that weren't always designed for you. Today on The Abstract, I'm joined by Shanti Ariker, Chief Legal Officer at JFrog, a NASDAQ-listed Israeli software company. Shanti's path has taken her from in-house roles at E-Trade to leadership roles at Salesforce.org, Autodesk, Twilio, Zendesk, and now at JFrog, with a lot of reinvention, resilience, and intentionality along the way. We're going to dive into how she's built a career defined by adaptability, pivots, and finding leadership in complex, high-stakes environments. With that, Shanti, welcome to this episode of The Abstract.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here.
And I think you were a referral from someone, one of my previous guests. I can't remember if it was Ron Bell or someone like that. So I love that. Maybe you'll have some recommendations for me if you have a good time after we record together.
Totally. Yeah, I think it was Dana Rao.
Oh, it was Dana Rao. Yes, that's a great episode. Folks should listen to that one if they haven't yet. Okay, so I don't want to give sort of like short shrift to your early career, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is, you spent like 8 years working across law firms, E-Trade, startups. You're in California and Wisconsin. And something that I think is unusual, especially when you talk to folks who end up then really sort of like at the pinnacle as a CLO at some point, is you stepped away from full-time work for 6 years to focus on your family and raising your children. Let's explore that. Was that a tough decision for you to make at the time? Were you nervous about that?
If you would have asked me when I was a first or second year, do you plan on taking time off, having kids, getting married, etc., I would have said no. No. And in fact, I think people asked me that question. I said, well, that's never going to happen. And I don't cook and I don't do anything and I don't know how to do it. I don't plan to learn. And so it was a huge leap of faith. And it was also a major change. And part of it was I fell in love and, things change. My husband, who's still my husband today, after almost 25 years, we needed to move for his career. And I never thought about having to do that before, having to put somebody else's career ahead of my own. But I did it. And then I had children and, they had some special health needs for a while. And it just didn't make sense between all the moving that we did for my husband's career and for the kids' needs that I go back to work. So
Mm-hmm.
I took a back seat. And being the type A person that I am, I continued to learn and do different things as a non-working mom.
Mm-hmm.
And I did learn how to cook and how to, bake and do different things with the PTA and other and use my skills in other ways that I wasn't even aware that I could do at when I took off from the working world. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the thing that I learned the most is that the skills that you bring to the table as somebody that you're working, those are the same skills you need as a parent. Networking with the other moms has always been helpful. And in fact, that's how I got my job at Salesforce in Canada, which we'll talk about in a little while, was through a mom's group. Not
We did a prep call. I didn't know that. That's great. We will talk about that. I mean, this is not foreign to me. My mom was a kindergarten teacher before she had me, and I don't think any of that training to be a kindergarten teacher went to waste whatsoever, because she, spent her time with me and my sister, and like already knew how to work with kids. And I think it's a great decision, and it's a different sort of life experience, but not an easier path by any stretch of the imagination. When you were thinking about re-entering the workforce, what was that process like? How did you decide that it made sense for you? I guess also, from a sort of like wider lens perspective, do you think there are things that we should do? A lot of folks who are listening to this are leaders at companies to improve that process for parents who might want to re-enter the workforce.
Yeah. So first, when I thought about reentering the workforce, I needed to sit down with my husband and talk about it because things were going to have to change, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we did it in phases. I had to take a series of exams because we were then living in Canada. And in order to requalify, I first had to take these prerequisites before I was even allowed to think about sitting and writing the bar there.
Hmm.
So in order to do that, I hired somebody to oversee the kids and to pick them up from school. And that allowed them to start to see something a little bit different than they were used to and get comfortable with being around other people to watch them. And
Mm-hmm.
after that, I felt more comfortable as well. But I really didn't feel good about a decision about going back to work because I knew how I was as a lawyer that I wouldn't be able to go back into work without really giving, so much of myself. And then how was I going to be able to be a mom, the mom that I wanted to be, and also the worker that I wanted to be, and think about my career as I wanted to do. So I sat down with my husband and I talked about, here's what it's really going to be like when I go back to work. And are you
Mm-hmm.
willing for that? Are you willing to have that be something that we consider as a family? Because it's not just a decision about me. At the end of the day, it's going to affect all four of us. And so how will that, how will you add to that? What's the equation for our family? What kind of help do we need? And that sort of thing. So we ultimately decided that we would all agreed that I should go back to work. And we started out actually with just an after school care program.
Uh-huh.
But, those programs require you to be on time to pick up your kids. Start charging you like $1 or $5 or $10 every minute you're late to really incentivize you to be on time. And after the third time of it didn't work out well for me, I realized I needed to up the ante and get, a full-time helper, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little bit easier to do in Canada because of the sponsorships that you can get for visas,
Hmm.
etc. And so I did realize, and I did have to go through some differences in order to figure out what the right, help was going to look like for me, and that was affordable and obtainable where I was living. But I think it's a really good question. I always tell especially, young people that I'm speaking to and I lecture, or especially young women, but anybody who wants
Hmm.
to have life outside of their firm or their, their in-house position, that I took 6 years off because I want people to know it's possible to take that time off and still get ahead. But it wasn't a, done deal by any means. And I did need a lot of help along the way, not just
Hmm.
from helpers, not just from my husband, but also from people who gave me opportunities because I went and told them about what I was looking for and that I needed their help to get there. And so that really was something that I constantly advocate for people to be open about their career aspirations at any time. I think if you're asking, what people can do to help people who've been out of the workforce, I think it's, networking with people, taking calls.
Sure.
I have gotten calls from people, even lately. I've been out of the workforce for a few years. What should I consider doing different? What should my resume look like? What courses should I
Hmm.
take, et cetera? Can we have almost like an intern program for people that come back into the workforce? Why not?
Yeah.
But what's the difference? Because
Yeah.
interns come in without knowing really much about anything in the middle of college, don't really know how to work in an office. Somebody who hasn't worked for years may have the same issues,
Hmm.
haven't used Google Suites. They used Microsoft only, or, things have changed. They haven't used ChatGPT,
Hmm.
whatever it is, and they need to up level their skills. They may need to just know what the differences are. We've automated a lot of processes nowadays. We use Slack. There's a lot of things
Sure.
we're expected to know how to use that you wouldn't even have any idea about if you weren't. And then don't even get me started on phishing and cybersecurity and all the things that if you're not looking, you might not be focused on, those kinds of issues. So I think there's a lot we can do to educate people who want to come back into the workforce.
Last sort of question on this, when you came back into the workforce, I think uh, it was sort of what folks might describe as like you have to take one step back sometimes to take two steps forward. Like you re-entered as a contracts manager as opposed to as an associate general counsel or reporting straight to the C-suite. Or what was your mindset during that transition, and how did you make it happen?
So, after being off for 6 years, we had moved to Canada and I had taken the bar and a series of exams before that. So I was very proud of myself that I had gotten requalified, but it was 2009. And to be practical,
Hmm.
there were lots of layoffs and people who weren't going to get jobs. And, if I wanted to work, I had to be willing to put my foot in the door anywhere. And
Hmm.
wasn't as focused on title or salary as I was on getting Canadian background and feeling like I had some sort of stamp of approval from
Hmm.
being in Canada. I wasn't sure how long we would live in Canada. We ended up living there for 8 years. But, I wasn't sure what the future would bring. And I wanted to have the opportunity to do something with my career. And I needed to take some sort of first step. So I decided it was the right thing to do. And I wanted to, once I got my foot in the door, I tried to prove myself that I was more than a contracts manager. Not to say that
Hmm.
contract managers have anything wrong with them, but I had that
Sure.
background and I had the bar exam and I wanted to be able to do more. And so, I did whatever I could to raise my hand to do additional things in order to try to get more responsibility and to be able to earn that counsel title back again.
You ended up becoming the first lawyer that Salesforce hired in Canada as they were growing. How'd you make that happen? I mean, that seems like a big inflection point for you, one, because of that, but also because of what comes next, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, so back in 2011, which was when I was hired, Salesforce was not well known like it is today. It was still a smallish company under 2 billion in revenue. And,
Uh-huh.
so imagine that was a long time ago, right? Um, almost 15 years ago. And so, um, first of all, getting in my foot in the door was difficult. I did try through contacts that I had in California, but that didn't really help me. And I had somewhat given up on the role when I went to a book club that was being hosted at my house for these moms that I had met through this moms club about
Uh-huh.
kids of, around the same age as my own. And somebody who worked at Salesforce in the past happened to be there and said, hey, there's this new role. I know you were interested in Salesforce, and why don't you apply? And I told her, well, I did apply, and, sent it to all these people who sent it to the General Counsel in California. But she said, well, you send it to me. Send me your resume. I'll make sure that you get seen. And I said, I'm sorry, but I don't know how that's going to help. I sent it to all these people who I finally said to her, like, why would this make a difference? And she said, well, I'll give it to my husband. And I said, who's your husband? And she said, oh, he runs the Toronto office. Should have been my first question. But that only got me an interview, but then
Sure.
my foot in the door through the experience I'd already had, and the fact that I did know how to do a lot of the agreements they were talking about, and the fact that I'd been working already in Canada helped as well. So if I had just had the US experience, I'm really not sure I would have gotten the job. In fact, the guy that hired me told me, he wouldn't have hired me without that Canadian experience.
Once you were in Salesforce, I think, as folks often want to do, right, you want to continue to sort of grow. And, you might have advocated for yourself and gotten a little bit more than you bargained for in eventually building Salesforce's pro bono program, becoming the GC of the foundation, taking on Salesforce.org. Talk us through that process, how you started to sort of expand your remit within an organization like Salesforce, and what you were proud of accomplishing.
So first, I came in as an individual contributor, but within a few weeks, I was already given managerial. And actually, when I interviewed, I was told, maybe we should have gone a different way. I almost had to basically re-interview explaining why I could be a manager. So before the job was even given to me, it was almost taken away. But I managed to convince this deputy GC that I was management material. And so when I first started out, I hired somebody within a few weeks, and it was like the blind leading the blind, because I still didn't really know what the job was, and I was already training somebody new. But quickly I learned a lot, and I was able to successfully oversee this person who's also a really great lawyer. So it was easy. And I wanted to manage more people. And eventually I was given the ability to manage a whole team from which oversaw commercial lawyers in all of Canada and then southward. So from Chicago on down through Texas. And so, and then eventually it became larger and included some of the West, some of the East, etc. And when I decided I wanted to move back to the US after 8 years in Canada, I was given the opportunity to oversee the entire Western region plus the Central. Eventually, I traded Canada for LATAM and South America. But when I got to the US, I had been doing a lot with charitable foundations and in the Toronto office. And I really wanted to continue that. The other thing I didn't mention, while I was taking the 6 years off, I became the head of the PTA for the school. I oversaw the redoing a park in my neighborhood and a bunch of things that I did kind of in my free time.
Yeah.
So, wanting to be involved in the community, and also having done pro bono when I was an associate in law firms early in my career, I really wanted to bring that ability to do that and work with people from across the spectrum and give access to justice to people throughout the department. So I went to the person who oversaw the foundation and I said, I'd love to start this pro bono opportunity. And she said, great, nobody else has brought it up, so go for it. And then I spoke with the General Counsel and she gave me the green light and we went forward with it. And it was very successful. We tried to do a lot of local projects, but also global projects and partnering with law firms and aid societies. And I continued to run it for about 4 years. That got me some FaceTime with the general counsel, who I went to regularly and would say, hey, I feel a little bit behind in my career because I took these 6 years off. And, having shown her what I could do on some of these side projects, she began giving me more side projects. And one day she showed up in my office and she said, I really need you to look into this tax issue with the foundation.
Uh-huh.
And I said, let me stop you right there. I'm not a corporate lawyer. I'm a commercial lawyer. Head up the commercial team, in case you didn't realize that. And she said, oh, I know exactly what you are. And now you're my nonprofit lawyer because you head up the pro bono. And so, oh, okay. Well, I literally said to her, I don't know anything about that. She said, oh, I have faith in you and you'll figure it out.
That's good leadership right there.
So, and, really I had been harping on these issues of, I don't have anything exciting. I'm doing the same thing over and over. I want to learn more. I want to do more. I want to be a leader. She came to me with these opportunities. And then when I said, hey, I don't know what to do, she said, you'll figure it out. And so I started working on a project for her related to the foundation and the .org. And when they called me and said, we'd like you to be the general counsel. And I said, whoa, wait, I don't think I can go anywhere because I've been helping the general counsel and I don't want to leave her in a lurch. And so I said, no, I'm not doing it. And I contacted her and I said, oh, they called me and this is what happened. And she said, Shanti, how do you think they called you? Do you think they came out of a hat? I wanted them to call you. And I was like, oh, this moment dawned on me that she was pulling some of the strings and doing the things that I'd asked her to do. So, of course, I ended up taking the position and learning so much. And a lot of it was just things that were not within my expertise. And I did speak to her before taking the job about my lack of knowledge and how can I, what are the things I can do to shore up the knowledge I need, how I can work with outside counsel, who can I work with on her team to come up with some safety net on, learning some of the areas that I wasn't as familiar with. And she sat next to me in my first few board meetings and whispered in my ear when I needed to say, can I get a motion for this? Because I had no idea how to do anything. So, I really always thank Amy Weaver, who had been the general counsel, then the CLO, then the CFO of Salesforce, and today is CEO of a large relief organization, for really pushing me, beyond my comfort zone and giving me the opportunities that I could then, take and prove myself with.
It sounds like that was a really formative sort of experience for you in terms of feeling like, you could be the GC, you could take this on. A couple sort of questions for you on that. Salesforce.org, the foundation, this is a unique sort of model environment. Do you feel like that has continued to shape your approach to lawyering? And, how did you eventually decide it was time to move on to the next thing?
Yeah, the model is very innovative. We were a social enterprise, Salesforce.org. Salesforce.org was a 501c4, which means that it can actually sell. The foundation was the granting entity for the most part. And so it was a very unique model that actually has been replicated in things like OpenAI. Not something that I would necessarily recommend because it's fraught with danger and risk. With some of the things that we've seen play out in the media with OpenAI are things that, we also saw concerns around. And also reabsorbing, which is ultimately what happened to Salesforce.org, reabsorbing it into a for-profit company is no easy feat either. You need approval from the Attorney General of the state you're operating in, things like that. So, but back to your question about looking at this from an innovative perspective, yes, I think, that really was an out of the standard model. And it did make us think a lot about what else could we do differently. And I'm constantly saying this about, just today I had a meeting with some people on my team talking about innovation and saying it doesn't just apply to the company, it applies to all of us. How can we do something different in our own team that's innovative, that's groundbreaking, whether it's use of AI, whether it's some other thing that allows us to be more pragmatic and less administrative in our day-to-day. And it's also around, what can you see as a lawyer operating within your company where, we often see all the different broken pieces and people will say, oh yeah, we have this issue. But, legal can often say, oh, we have an idea about how to fix that. And,
Yes.
why can't we raise our hands and say that? I recently did that with an issue that we had, went to the CEO and he said, that's a great idea. And we ended up implementing it. It had nothing to do with the legal team.
As you left Salesforce, as you mentioned, sort of Salesforce.org becomes, right, like reacquired or brought back into Salesforce. You decided it was time to move on. How did you decide what you were going to look for next in your career? You've been GC now, so.
Well, I talked to Amy again. She'd been a great mentor to me and a sponsor. And, I told her, look, I've thought a little bit about what I want to do in the future, and I really would love your job, not your job, the same type of job. And so how do I get there? What do you think? And, the easiest avenue would have been to go to a pre-IPO company that I thought was going to go public and toil away until it went public.
Sure.
But I early on went to a private company that was supposed to go public in the .bomb era, and I ended up laying off the entire company. So was always very allergic to doing that again. So it wasn't an option for me that I wanted to take that level of risk right now. So I said, what else can I do? So she started to network, have me network with different people, think about informational interviews. And I really came to find that being at Salesforce.org and Foundation were great. The fact that I had the General Counsel title was great, but I was branded as a nonprofit lawyer. And
sure.
I realized that I wasn't really running a nonprofit legal department because we were doing deals with customers and partners. We were creating new tech and products and all the things that you would do as a GC of a private company or, a company that's for profit. And so I realized I needed to go back into a for-profit company to prove that I was still in that world. And I realized that going straight from being a nonprofit GC to a for-profit public company GC was an unreasonable kind of idea. So I thought, I'm going to have to take a couple of steps. So one of the steps was to go to a bigger company like Autodesk to oversee a direct sales, commercial sales organization and customer support. So they had recently undergone a change where they were starting to sell more subscriptions than licenses and moving more into the cloud, and also moving from just a straight reseller model to more of a direct sales model. So both of them were very new. So we had to change a lot of the terms and conditions and the ways we operated. And so overseeing this team allowed me to, get my footing back, get up to date on things, also do this new, change from license to subscription, because being at Salesforce, we were, native to the cloud. We didn't have those. So it was interesting to see the pivots they had done on their business model and their operating model. So that was interesting. But at the end of the day, having been the GC running the department and then overseeing this small little part of the department was a little bit it did feel like a step back. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
found out that Twilio was hiring for both commercial and corporate a deputy GC, I raised my hand for it, although I hadn't been at Autodesk for very long. And, um, I really did love Autodesk. It was a great company, great products, really great legal department. And I loved my boss, but I just felt like I wanted to do more. But the minute I told him, he said, "We knew you weren't going to be here very long. We're happy to be here for as long as you were." So I left and I went to Twilio and I oversaw both the commercial, which
Mm-hmm.
at that point felt very comfortable doing, and then the corporate, which was more of a stretch because I had done a lot of corporate work around subsidiary management when I was at Salesforce.org, but I hadn't done the public company reporting or M&A to any real degree
Mm-hmm.
or financings and things like that. So all those things I accomplished in a very short order at Twilio. We did 5 or 6 M&As, including Segment, which was like $4.5 billion. We did $1 billion financing. We did all kinds of different things. And so I got a lot of experience, and it was exactly what I had been looking for to fill my background in. And it's not that I say that this was the approach that I take. Everybody has a different story on how they got to GC, and I'm sure you hear them all from being on
Yeah.
the podcast. And some people don't ever fill that in and feel comfortable. I really wanted to feel like I understood a little bit about Reg SK and FD and all the things that you typically handle as the GC. But I think the secret sauce that I've continued to have is that commercial background and really be able to pick up a deal from my team,
Mm-hmm.
any escalations, and instantly understand because it's so many years I did practice commercial law. So I, eventually got a call from a recruiter about the Zendesk position. And it was really like, wait a minute, I hadn't been at Twilio all that long. We were extremely busy in the middle of the pandemic, and we had been a pandemic darling. So, my team grew by 20 people during the pandemic because
Wow.
it was an explosive growth. And we were doing all this M&A, et cetera. But when I had been plodding along, here's what I will do in order to become a public company GC. And Zendesk was a very well thought of software company in the B2B software space. And it seemed like the perfect opportunity. So I couldn't pass up at least talking to them. And they moved so fast. Within like a week and a week, I had an offer, and I was like, whoa. And so I thought about it for probably like 5 minutes. At first I was like, well, I have a decent job at Twilio. Twilio's doing really well, but I've always wanted to be a public company GC, and now I have an offer on the table to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I say no to that. And they don't come around every day until 2021, where I do think that were coming around every day because there's so much. Everybody and their mother was becoming a general counsel, but I didn't know that in December of 2020 when I took the position. And I don't think I would have done anything differently because, I think Zendesk was and continues to be a great company, great name
Mm-hmm.
in the industry. And I learned so much from that job because of everything that happened right after, within 6 months of joining.
I will briefly plug. I had Mark Kahn on as a guest probably like a year and a half ago, maybe almost 2 years ago. We didn't talk. You mentioned the Segment acquisition. We didn't talk super in depth about that. That wasn't really the focus of the episode, but we do talk about his personal transition through that and how he got to Segment and eventually at the time was an executive recruiter. And if folks like this episode, they might like that one too. There's a lot of overlap in the great guests that I'm lucky to get to talk to.
Yeah, and Mark and we had only overlapped by a few months, but it was great to get to know him. And
Yeah. Okay, well, you've started to allude to this, right? So you become GC of Zendesk in late 2020. There's a proposed acquisition of SurveyMonkey that folks may remember. Some activist investors get involved in the business. I've had other folks on to talk deeply about sort of dealing with activist investors. We don't have to talk in depth about that. But eventually then there's a take private, like a sort of consortium of PE funds come together and take the business private for a little north of $10 billion. So this is a big deal, right? How would you describe that whole chapter of your career? Because that sounds like any one of those possible events or any one of those events would be a lot for a GC to deal with.
Yeah, I like to say that when I first went to the Berkeley Symposium on Corporate Securities Law, that I felt like I needed a primer on everything they were talking about because I didn't really understand any of it. After being at Zendesk for a few years, I felt like I lived every single thing that everybody spoke about that following year. So it went from one extreme to the other.
A true education.
Yeah, I like to say I got a PhD in corporate governance at Zendesk. For the first 6 months, it was very much the standard GC gig, learning about the team, getting to know the company, putting in place some different changes and things like that. But then once we announced the acquisition of Momentive, which was what the company was called at the time, that owned SurveyMonkey, and we immediately had some dissatisfaction in the ranks of our shareholders. And then it got worse, and we had activists, and we ultimately received an unsolicited bid. Like, so many things happened with so many board meetings already, that, I learned a lot about how the process works, about proxy solicitation and all of that. But then we began a secret process to what's obviously not secret anymore. But at the time it was secret to explore a sale of the company. And so we started to look around at that. We put the company in play. We had endless amounts of meetings. We had, between the Momentive and that deal, we did have over 100 board meetings. It was like at least 4.
Wow.
It was pretty crazy, and it was really necessary with the number of activists we had, the number of things going on. Keeping people up to date was important, and it really was a whirlwind of activity. And we kept joking that every corner case that could possibly happened to us. Not so much so that Wachtell Lippin, who's was my
Sure.
selects a deal every year that they teach at Harvard Law School, and they selected Zendesk because it was just so wild, and I got to teach the class with
That's incredible.
And then they liked it so much they asked me to come back and teach at Stanford as well. So I did the same thing at Stanford.
That's amazing. I would love to take that course or lecture series or whatever they do. That's really cool. I love that turn of phrase, sort of like a PhD in corporate work. 100 board meetings. I think I hear from a lot of GCs who ask, how do I manage my relationship with the board? As you're going through this, what is the right sort of relationship look like with your CFO, CEO, management team? How do you work together in the right way? Any lessons that you'd have around those sorts of governance dynamics that you would want to share? Because you have such practical and comprehensive experience.
Yeah, I think it can get difficult depending on the players and what's going on and all the different stakes in play. But as being as transparent as you can with the whole management team, because if you're not, then people feel like the rug got pulled out from under them. As a result, they may not want to stick around. And I think, the difference in counsel also was apparent in how we kept the board up to date. So in the Momentive deal, we had an executive committee that handled most of the information related to the deal. And then we updates to the board. But Wachtell's advice was just to have the board involved in every step of the way. And I think although it was more difficult to have board meeting after board meeting, it was helpful because we didn't need to constantly getting people up to date on what happened in the executive committee.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it also allowed everybody to feel part of the process. And what I offered we offered a couple of things. One was kind of an activism 101 class for anybody who didn't feel comfortable. And it wasn't mandatory, but anybody on the board could come. And also the management team, was provided that same information. And then the other thing was just making sure that people could come to me or anybody, on my team to ask no dumb question, so
Yeah.
we could feel like they could, come to the meeting and understand what was happening.
Maybe there's another question in there too. One last sort of question on this, which is, if there are activist investors in particular, right? I mean, there's publicity around this and there's news coverage, and that's part of the, I don't know if I call it a game, but that's part of the strategy that they're playing, right? Things that you learned about, helping your team and helping the company stay focused and like keeping culture up, and in the midst of something that, you might not want it to be as public of a process as it is, but the shareholders on the other side, right, have a strong incentive to make it very public.
Yeah, so I was very tied at the hip with my head of comms.
Yeah.
And we worked very closely together, and things often broke in the Wall Street Journal, and then they would tell us, this is about to hit the paper and
Mm-hmm.
online, and do you have a comment? And we would say, we don't even have this letter yet. Nick, can you read what? Which is crazy. But I think it is very difficult when you're in the midst of such a giant fight like that to keep your culture and to be
Mm-hmm.
transparent, because you can't be transparent. You can't disclose without disclosing to all your shareholders. So you can't disclose to
Mm-hmm.
our employees. So that became a difficult and led to some of the decisions we made, like announcing that the deal wasn't going to go through and we were going to remain public, and then
Mm-hmm.
deciding 2 weeks later to take the deal because they wanted to be able to tell the employees, but I think it backfired. So I do think there needs to be a lot of thought into what can and can't you say, and whether you want to make filings just so that you can talk to your employees, because
Mm-hmm.
if you don't, then your hands are really tied behind your back. The other thing is, what gets put in the press and how much press you get. It's not completely in your control, but how you work with, crisis communications firm and maybe taking their advice on things. Sometimes we didn't always, do that. And I think you can pay the price for that. We were lucky in the fact that while all of this crazy story was going on, there was an even crazier story. So people didn't even necessarily notice us because Twitter was in the middle of their own fight.
And that I can imagine, I remember, was getting lots of press.
I recall having a meeting with a call with on a pivotal day with my lead director, independent director, and to make me feel better, he said, "Well, I just got off the phone with another GC who's in the midst of this. We're feeling really bad." And I said, "Who?" And he tells me the name, and I said, "Oh, the GC of Twitter. Okay, I feel better."
There's always someone who's having a worse day. Perspective, right? Well, I have a feeling that you're going to be getting a couple calls from public company GCs asking for some free counsel after this is released. I mean, how do you follow this up, right? So, like, after Zendesk, what was it that drew you to your current role at JFrog? And I mean, something that is different about this is JFrog is an Israeli company. I mean, what was it like stepping into a leadership role at a company where you have a lot of employees abroad in Israel and elsewhere?
So something I didn't mention at the beginning is that when I was 18, I moved to Israel and immigrated as an immigrant, which is called making Aliyah. And I stayed there for about 5 years. So while my Hebrew has become very rusty, I can speak Hebrew and I do have that background. And so I was very intrigued when I was, notified that there was this position. And I thought, hey, maybe my worlds are colliding. I've done a lot of um, work on boards for Israeli organizations, and I
Mhm.
wanted to check it out, but I really didn't think seriously about it because it's a much smaller company than Zendesk was, and I thought, if anything, I'll go to the same size or a larger company. But I was really wowed by the company, the culture, the people. I also knew the VP of Finance, who's now our CFO,
Mhm.
well. And so, I had the ability to ask a lot of questions before I joined and feel like I really knew the company well enough by the time I started there.
I guess crisis didn't leave you behind, right? In this role. If I remember correctly, you started around September of 2023. And then obviously folks remember, right? Like, the attack on October 7th, just a short time afterwards. Um, how do you think about, and my understanding of Israeli companies is that they're very good at this, right? But like, how do you think about sort of business continuity in a situation like that? And I don't know, did you feel like you were able to draw on a lot of your lessons from Zendesk about leadership in crisis, or do you feel like you still had things to learn in a situation like that?
I really had things to learn, honestly, because it's just a totally different scenario when it's people's well-being, their health,
Hmm.
their stress of the what happened on October 7th, the brutal nature of
Hmm.
attacks, and of sometimes the reactions to those attacks on a global basis. And so
Hmm.
it was extremely stressful for me as a Jew, but also stressful for me as a manager and a leader of people who I'd only been managing for a month, uh,
Right.
to be there for them. And some of them had family members who were affected. Everybody in Israel knew somebody who at least something had happened. Some people had narrow escapes from their family members or for themselves. And so, it was a very stressful time. And I think my main focus was making sure that we could take whatever burden off of their plates and put it on the plates of the US team while they
Mm.
needed the time. Now, I have to say, Israelis are so resilient, and so much has happened constantly in Israel that they have to be, but it doesn't mean that they want to be. But often work is a good distraction from what's happening around you. And I'm
Sure.
constantly in shock by how much they're willing to do work, even in the middle of missile attacks by Iran. People were working on documents on my team. It's
That's that. I would not be doing that myself, but I understand that. I don't know. Maybe you don't know how you would react until you're in a situation like that, or you've experienced that many times over and over.
tough.
I'm curious if you sort of like look back and reflect, helping lead these companies through either different crises or sort of different problem sets too. Do you feel like your approach to leading teams and leadership and being on an executive team has evolved over time?
I'm sure it has evolved. I mean, I'm more mature every year.
Sure.
Let's call it that. Um, and I've been through a lot of different things in my life, and I try to be as empathetic as I can. I'm not always able to be, and you try to be both pragmatic and empathetic for the business and for the people, and see it from different sides of things, right? It's not always easy. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions, but I do try to think through all those different aspects, not just the legality of the situation.
Sure. One of the things that I've enjoyed is you write a newsletter on LinkedIn. And I also understand that you have written or you're working on a memoir as well. So tell us a little bit about both of
Yes.
those. And then I'm also really curious, like, what drove you to want to start to write share your story more publicly. I have this, right? I think that you get better, like the more that you practice, the more you make it a habit or routine, right? That you see how it accrues over time. Tell us about both of these projects and what your experience has been with them.
Sure. So I started in-house lawyering and beyond in January, kind of a little bit as a challenge to myself. Could I actually do a bi-weekly newsletter? At first, I thought, there's no way. How do I have time to do this? But I kept seeing in various organizations that I belong to the same questions coming up over and over. And I saw that, as I'm getting on in my years and I see new people coming in, the same questions keep being asked over and over. And I thought, well, I have a lot of the answers, and maybe not all the answers, and maybe there's a new way to do things and I can learn as well. So a combination of wanting to continue to network with people and different, people that are just coming up, people, I always like to be meeting new people. Many people that I know are retiring. I want to have the access to people that are in the midst of their careers. And I love to teach. And I also, I've been having fun writing, and I wanted to write a newsletter that was a little snarky.
I like the tone personally. It feels very authentic, let's say.
Because people, if you're reading an article about, the do's and don'ts of something, you get a little bored sometimes when you're scrolling through. And I thought it'd be more fun and more engaging. So far I've gotten good feedback, and I've been able to keep it going, and that's been great. But I have been, my journey to start writing my memoir started about 6 or 7 years ago. And I won't bore you with all the details, but, it's been a long journey of learning about the publishing industry, whether I want to self-publish or traditional publish. I'd like to plan on traditionally publishing. And I'm, making strides towards that. Have a final manuscript. I've had to learn how to write a book proposal. So I've been working on all of these areas. And it's been another thing to learn and very interesting. And, having to come at it, it doesn't matter how much I've done in my legal career. This is a whole different ballgame. So
absolutely,
it's been very, very interesting, humbling. And I really enjoy writing, so I'm going to keep doing it. I've now been writing some short stories, and getting those published little by little as well.
That's fantastic. I hope to see it on a shelf near me at Barnes & Noble sometime. And I understand the publishing industry takes a while from some friends who've written books, but maybe by early 2026, it'll be on a shelf somewhere. That would be fantastic.
Let's hope so.
As we start to wrap up, Shanti, I've got some traditional closing questions that I like to ask my guests. I want to ask a few of you. My first one for you is what your favorite part of your day-to-day at JFrog is.
Well, I guess every day is really different, but I really, if you would have asked me a few years ago, would you really enjoy going into the office? I would have said no, but I really do enjoy. We come in 3 days a week at JFrog, and I really love sitting down with my team at lunch, talking to people every day, meeting people in the hallway, and all the celebrations that we have at JFrog. It's just a lot of fun.
The flip side, I think this is funny though. Do you have a professional pet peeve? Maybe this could be the subject of one of your newsletters.
I really get annoyed when people think it's funny to say the legal department is the department of no.
Oh, I hear that a lot.
I've worked so hard to be a solution-minded person and to hammer that home to my team, but people still often will say it's stuck in legal when it's not necessarily stuck in legal, or it's stuck in legal because legal has been given information from the security team that we can't agree to, or something like that. So we tend to bear the brunt of a lot of these why things stall.
Yes. I don't think you're alone in being frustrated by that perception. which I think oftentimes is wrong. As you mentioned, I mean, legal is one of the most cross-functional teams, and often sees solutions that others don't. My last question for you, Shanti, my traditional closing question for my guests, it's if you could look back on your career and think about maybe when you were a young lawyer just getting started, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
I was really nervous that I would fail, and also that I had to pick one type of law. And if I didn't pick the right one, it would be a disaster. And I originally was very sure that I wanted to do environmental law until I spent a summer associate position, one half summer at a U.S. PERG and doing Clean Water Act review.
Huh.
So boring. And so I realized then and there that I couldn't just do administrative type law and I needed to do something else. But, I've dabbled in a little bit of everything. And I think if I would have known at the beginning, what I tell law students is, you may have an idea about your career that it's going to go in this one direction that some people might know, I want to be a litigator. That's all I want to do. But I tried litigation. I didn't love it. Having the background has been helpful as a GC. I've tried a little bit of everything, and I think that makes you a valuable general counsel. And also it makes you more empathetic for all the people on your team. So I think if there's one thing I would want people to take away is that, just because you're doing something today doesn't mean you have to be doing it tomorrow. You might need to create a path for how do you get to the other thing that you're really looking to do. But, and that's through networking, talking to people, educating yourself, getting certifications or what have you. But you can do so much with a legal degree, whether it's in the legal team or outside the legal team.
I think that's a lesson that will resonate with folks across our audience, right? Whether they're students, associates, or folks who are more senior and have been working in the law for even a couple of decades in some cases. This has been an absolute pleasure, Shanti. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Abstract, and we hope to see you next time.